Aloha attendees, thank you for coming. I'm Roger Jelinek, Executive Director of the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. And I just wanted to alert you to the fact that this is being recorded, live streamed, and restreamed. It'll be visible on Facebook and YouTube. And for those of your Ohana network that couldn't make it, it will be available in a day or two on the UHERO Better Tomorrow Speakers YouTube channel. And it will be video edited for highlights, and that version will be up on our website for about a year. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Kamana. Mahalo.
Velina mai, ke aloha ka Aina, aloha mai kako. Hope everyone's having a fantastic Wednesday, October 13th. Been having some great conversations here virtually, and I hope everybody can just kind of tune in, kick back, let the light bulbs turn on or the stew simmer, whatever it is going on in your home right now. And really looking forward to this conversation on circular economies. So mahalo to Roger, Hawaii Book and Music Festival, for your leadership in putting together these series of events. And I'd like to thank the sponsors, and deep mahalo to everyone out there fighting for change in our communities. And I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. So we have today some awesome thinkers, academics, researchers, economists, directors of sustainability all across Hawaii that have vast experience in considering some of these issues around circular economies. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So we have Sumner La Croix. Sumner is a professor emeritus at University of Hawaii in Manoa in the Department of Economics, and is a research fellow with UHERO. Matthew Lynch. Matt is our executive director of sustainability all across UH. He's a champion for sustainability efforts and a former businessman, now leading the good life. And Kirsten Oleson. Kirsten is an associate professor of ecological economics in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management at UH Manoa. She has a fantastic lab and has done substantial work in rethinking the ways that we want to calibrate success for our economies. And so myself, I'm Kamana Mai Kalani Beamer. I'm the Dana None Hall Chair at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and just a humble servant for Aloha Aina throughout our islands. So Aloha Nui Kako. Let's get started. For those attending, you can feel free to list some questions in the chat as we're going through our sets of questions, and I will try my best to uplift some of those in our conversation. But I wanted to kind of kick us off. Maybe people joined the earlier panel. I was able to have I thought it was a really fruitful conversation with Kate Raworth on Doughnut Economics. So hopefully some of you caught that. If not, you can check into that. But I think this event will sort of build off of that. And so our first question, and we can just take this, Kirsten, Matt, Summer, we can all take a stab at these questions and, unmute our mics and just feel free. I got some chickens in the background, all these other things, so we'll be fine with that. But our first question is, do we have to change our existing economic model, and is it possible? And I want to frame this a bit. Many of us are advocating for change, and oftentimes, the first question is, is it even possible? We've seen some of the, what should we call them? Letters to the editor, things saying tourism will never change. Our lives are going to continue in this facet forever. Just give it up. We've seen other things saying, hey, it's not so bad. Why don't you move somewhere else? And so there's a lot of people that believe, this existing economic model simply is so mammoth, is so gargantuan that it can't be changed. So what do our panelists think about that? can we change our existing economic model? Is that even possible?
I'll take a stab at that.
Thank you.
You know, in Hawaii, we've had constant change. I mean, if I look back at when I first came to Hawaii in 1981, sugar and pineapple were huge parts of the economy here. I was constantly running into people who grew up on sugar and pineapple plantations, and it was a very different place. Tourism was large then, and you know, tourism kind of reached its zenith in 1990, and it's been declining since then. If you go back and you look at the 1990s, you see tourism taking up over 35% of the economy. Where today it's fallen down into about 25%. It's probably over the next 15 years, it's going to fall down to that 19, 18. I doubt tourism is ever going to become just a trivial part of the Hawaii economy. But it's really worth remembering that if we look up a decade from now, we're likely to see that 80% of the economy here is non-tourism. You know, and again, that's very different than it being a 60-40 split and an 80-20 split. There's room to do a lot more here. And a lot of it is making sure that we have the institutional prerequisites in place for it, that we're encouraging firms outside of tourism to both rise up inside Hawaii. And, you know, in many ways, we have a wonderful education system here. Yeah, it's got some problems, but there are all sorts of incredibly educated people that come out of the Hawaii K through 12 system and that come out of the UH system and other people that locate here. We need to make sure Hawaii is a place where people who have new ideas can find it a hospitable place to express those new ideas, whether those ideas are based on traditional economics or economics that are more out on the edge of high tech, whether it's outsiders or whether it's insiders. I think it's useful to be looking at, you know, trying to come up with more opportunities for people who live here in Hawaii to start businesses. But we also need to be looking at Hawaii being a place for outsiders to come, because when you're not hospitable to outside ideas, you find that you become kind of a backwater, and that's when economies start to decline. You know, the inflow of new firms, of people saying, "I'll relocate my firm here from Silicon Valley," those are all positive signs. I continue to be an optimist, yet we face lots of challenges.
Mahalo, Summer. Great insights. Kirsten?
Yeah, I'll just follow on that. I think the type of tourism also matters, right? There are a lot of different models of tourism. Some are more extractive than others. And so, you know, we want to encourage tourism that brings high spenders who are coming to Hawaii because it's Hawaii, not just because it's a beach and a nice hotel, right? We want people to come and contribute to the local economy, hopefully do some community days, volunteer days, connect with the Hawaiian culture, and spend a lot of money, right? And you know, it's a kind of a quality over quantity question. And you see other places that have shifted their tourism economies very intentionally towards a sector that maybe focuses on the high end and or nature-based tourism. And so you don't get as much of the negative impacts of the tourism industry. You know, the cost benefit analysis just works out better for the economy.
Mahalo, Kirsten. Yeah, a lot of conversations about, you know, regenerative tourism, different forms, ecotourism, and you know, it being less extractive. So mahalo for those insights also. Hey, Matt, what do you think about this? Can we change our economic model? Is it possible?
Yeah, mahalo for the question. Can we change? Well, I was on a call earlier today with more than 30 leaders across all sectors who are enrolled in the Executive Education for Sustainability Leadership program at Harvard. And that's not even a question. Can we change? It's a must. It's a necessity. And we spent this morning exploring life's principles as articulated by the Biomimicry Design Lab, which sort of starts from the premise of life creates conditions that are conducive to life. And it's really exciting to be in this space where you have business leaders, civic leaders, community leaders, thinking about that as it applies to their enterprises and organizations. And these 6 principles, the first is evolve to survive. That's a given, right? Given the scale and magnitude of the challenges that we are already facing due to climate impacts and the cascading challenges that stem from that, it's an imperative. Life adapts to changing conditions. Life is attuned to, is locally attuned and responsive to local conditions. Life integrates development with growth. That's a complex notion that we can revisit later if my fellow panelists would like to. Life is resource efficient in materials and energy, and life uses life-friendly chemistry. And think about how we might apply those to our economic models, and recognizing, first of all, that economies are nested within ecologies, right? And this is something that you and I, Kamana, have had multiple conversations around, especially as it pertains to indigenous knowledge systems, because indigenous knowledge systems not only recognize that, they center everything around that, where we are not separate from quote unquote nature, we are family with. And the dominant paradigm of society and the dominant global paradigm of extractive, consumer-driven, never-ending growth economic models is no longer, it's not fit for life. And so it must change. That's just a basic evolutionary principle. If it doesn't, there are evolutionary consequences for that.
Yeah, mahalo for that, Matt. We're gathering a range of answers, here, and Matt's point is we must. We were all aware of the climate crisis, the vast and increasing social economic, inequality in our islands and across the world. The convergence of that with the rise of fascism and these other things that our world is in a huliao. It's in a period of change. And Summers, I clearly agree with Sumner that, we've had changes in our existing economic structure and economy. And as Kirsten's saying, the type of tourism, maybe there is hope for regenerative styles of tourism. I believe we can have allies for Aloha Aina, like Matt is talking about. We must change. To be slightly bold, I think people that say that we can't and we won't are either so thoroughly out of touch with the pulse of our people and the planet, or just embedded in the old structure so much that they just have blinders on. We have to change and adapt, and Hawaii is an exciting place for that, I believe.
I think it's worth remembering too that just going back to the 1950s and 60s when Hawaii became a state, there was a feeling of excitement that we'd be passing into something different. Okay, that the territorial government was one where people had little representation, and that at least statehood would leave people living within the state with more internal representation. All Hawaiian sovereignty issues here aside, I'm not trying to pick up on that issue, but the leadership of the state at the time seized on issues that the population wanted. I mean, previously, Hawaii was ruled from Washington, D.C. The governor was appointed by the president, Supreme Court justices were appointed by the president of the United States. All of a sudden, we had more internal control. And what do? We established a University of Hawaii. University of Hawaii up to the 50s was small beer. I mean, I'm not trying to demean it, but just all of a sudden a major university was put in place. That's because the state decided we're going to do this, and the leadership figured out how to do it. We didn't have a mandatory healthcare system. And yet by the 1970s, a system was put in place where we ended up by the 1980s of having the highest percentage of insured in the United States. And healthcare became much more accessible for a much larger percentage of people living in Hawaii. We need to look back and remember these changes are stuff that we prided ourselves on in the past, that we as a small state were able to be a leader. And I still think we're able to be a leader today. I look at things like the carbon tax report that I was one of the authors on with McKenna Kaufman, Maya Sharfstein, Charlene Hayasita, and McKenna Kaufman. I look at that report, and I think that report is basically saying, hey, let's move into a modern energy economy by putting a carbon tax on the use of fossil fuels. And that's something that we as a small state, what the report says, is that's something that we're capable of doing. We don't have to wait for the feds. We're capable of doing that now. And I think we need more of that can-do attitude among our political leadership, which is mirrored in I think, a struggle with very, very rundown government institutions that we have right now.
Yeah, mahalo for that, Sumner. I think, building off of that and the conversation with Kate, and appreciate your comment on sort of the diverse experiences of statehood.
Right. Well,
knowing that for many people, that certainly wasn't a democratic thing to celebrate, for Native Hawaiians in particular. But, some of the innovation, I think is interesting, right? I mean, Hawaii has a fairly robust healthcare system in comparison to other places in the United States. And, I think that fabric of, Aloha Aina, and even just the relationships that we have with each other, amongst local culture is probably, a part of that, right? For the impetus of that, I think, so I think we did have, some leadership that tried to bridge and think about society and people. What excites me about this moment and this time, particularly with Kate's work, is thinking about, these less extractive models, these models that aren't solely focused on an economic system that does provide for certain people, but not very well for most of us. And if we're being frank, even prior to COVID, the economic system that existing in Hawaii, tourism, for instance, vast ALICE statistics for people that are fully employed. These are people working super hard. And yet they're barely surviving. And so this economic model, what Kate is talking about in terms of redistributing not just income, but wealth, right? And meeting the needs of society and people at the same time is not going beyond these planetary boundaries, seems like an opportune moment where Hawaii has an opportunity. We are islands. We can see how finite our resources are. Nainoa and others, I don't have to say this, we've been talking about it for 20 plus years. So, building off of that, Kirsten and Matt, with your work, a lot of what Kate talked about was new metrics, new measurements, new models, right? New images for viewing what our economy should look like. So how does the way we measure and talk about success of our economy matter? And does it matter for achieving a better future, the way we measure, the way we talk about what is success? Because yes, hey, we can build hotels and degrade resources and build over EV and all these complex issues while paying people very minimal wages, and most of the money goes offshore. And that could be success, in certain economic models. But I think the one that we're thinking of for the future operates differently. So how do the metrics matter?
Yeah, so I can start off, and the multi-layered question, but what gross domestic product does, and it measures kind of market output of an economy, right? And it was never intended nor designed to reflect well-being or welfare of society. It had a very specific purpose at the end of the Depression, trying to get us out of the Depression. And even the inventor of the metric warned that it was not a meaningful indicator to judge progress or kind of how society is doing. Yet we fetishize it now, right? We use it and we use it as like the singular indicator of how the state is doing. We need growth in GDP, growth in GDP, growth in GDP. And maybe perhaps that was fine in a period where that is what we needed in order to lift society up and lift wages and get people working. But we're in a phase now where we are beyond the limits of the planet. We are undermining the fundamental construct of the economy. We're depleting resources and environmental quality, all in the name of growth. And we are causing all sorts of problems in society in terms of inequality, as you raised, And so there are alternatives to GDP. And one of the ones that I've been working on with collaborators at Hawaii Pacific University and DBED is called the Genuine Progress Indicator. Now, it doesn't get us as far as we probably need to go. It still is based on a kind of personal consumption as the foundation of utility, of like what generates welfare. But what it does do is it adds in unpaid labor. So all the care work, the care economy is incorporated. It adjusts income for inequality. So you don't get as many credits, welfare credits if you're extremely rich, right? It's and then it also deducts from that the costs to the environment and to society. So it starts to get us to the recognition that the environment and other things in society matter than economic production and consumption. And what it could do is maybe be like, the transitional medication we need to wean ourselves off of GDP, right? It's still one indicator, it's a number, you can report it, but it is far more holistic than GDP, right? Now, that said, the state also has some really wonderful dashboard metrics, right? Where we have from the grassroots identified things that matter to us as a state. And this is an ongoing process that then we can use these kind of customized metrics in natural units that matter and measure those over time to look at status and trends, right? And things like the proportion of food that was locally grown, for instance, or the reliance on renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuels, on inequality. And those sorts of dashboards get to Kate's point from the last session that like the earth tells us things on its own. We know when we're hitting limits, and let's listen to those metrics as well. We don't need to convert everything into an economic metric.
Mahalo. Thank you. Matt.
That's beautifully said. Kirsten, I'm such a big fan of your work on GPI. And there was an article we wrote for Civil Beat about a month ago. No, last year. Gosh, time is just a strange concept. I also worked on the state sustainability dashboard that you referenced in the early days of getting the Aloha Plus Challenge dashboard up. And I'm going to say something, and I don't want to devalue this very important work on metrics, because it is very important that we figure out what is important to measure, right? And given the scale and magnitude of the challenges and literally the stakes of our future generations, I don't think that we can actually afford incremental change. Joanne's question that she posted in the Q&A reminded me of Uncle Kalani Souza's key questions that he asks every chance he gets. And I think these are really important questions. Are the children fed? Are the elderly comfortable? Are the women unafraid? And what would it be important to measure if we're going to achieve that vision? Danella Meadows, who is the godmother, right, of complexity science and systems thinking, she wrote a key paper called Thinking in Systems. And in it, she identifies the key leverage points or places to intervene in a system to enact change. Well, the place that she identifies where is most impactful I feel like a James Bond villain here with the cat, excuse me. The area where she identifies is least impactful to intervene is the area that we most often intervene at, and that's numbers, subsidies, taxes, and whatnot. Just think about the enormous amount of time, money, and effort we spend debating and arguing and almost shutting down governments over those kinds of debates, right? And it is the least impactful place to intervene in the system. Metrics, the goals of the system, is listed as number 2 in Meadows' framework of places to intervene in a system. And the number 1 place that she identifies and articulates is the mindset or the paradigm from which the goals of the system and the entire system arise. So right now we are all captured by this story, this unhealthy, problematic story of growth at the expense of all else. And that is a self-terminating system. When Kate did the pipe versus the circle, that exponential growth curve that, you know, we have whole financial sectors optimizing for that. We have VCs optimizing for exactly that type of a growth curve. When that type of a growth curve occurs in a petri dish of microorganisms, there's a clear consequence that happens after that. It is an evolutionary principle. If we exceed the carrying capacity of our world, there are just consequences. And as Kate's illustration on her cardboard cutout so powerfully illustrated, we very clearly exceeded many of the life support systems of our planet. So I think it's time to be thinking beyond even circular economics, and we need to be thinking about regeneration. We need to be thinking about restoring, repairing, and regenerating the damage that has been done. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is if we can come up with more compelling stories than this story of never-ending consumer culture-driven extractive growth. So what if the story that we were wondering about is, what does Hawaii look like when all the children are fed, when all the elderly are comfortable, when our women are unafraid, when our beaches are clean and healthy, when our forests are rich and thriving? What does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that smell like? And then what do we need to do to get there? What are the things that we actually need to pay attention to and measure to get there? If economy is nested within ecology, and if we are not separate from ecology, if we are ecology, then I think we actually need to be, not only need to be, but can be asking better questions so that we can come up with more powerful stories and begin to solve for this.
Mahalo, Matt. I agree. You know, shifting our paradigm and the dominant perspectives on what success looks like is critical. And what great metaphors, you know, are the keiki fed, you know, are the wahine safe. You know, maybe many people are aware. It's over a year now ago, a group of us. In the midst of the COVID lockdowns, not sure exactly what was going to happen, but knowing that many of our communities were suffering, and during that shutdown, seeing the resilience of our natural systems, you know, hearing the mo'olelo about the pua returning to certain nearshore fisheries, lalakea sharks gathering, you know, kind of like our Aina reclaiming this space once the sunscreen had thoroughly left, you know, the ocean. We started Aloha Economic Futures, and we thought, hey, if we're gonna create a new economy, if we're gonna do something different, if we're gonna learn from the experience of COVID, you know, can we use our ancestral values, you know, values that worked for these islands in this place for centuries, to build off of. And I think, you know, much of the Aloha Aina Hawaiian movement in many ways has been built around shifting our paradigm, you know. PKO, the work of George Helm and others, occupying islands to stop them from being bombed, you know, it was about a paradigm shift. It was about best use of our Aina and our place. And it was incredibly controversial, you know, at the time. And so, yeah, so how do we create these paradigm shifts, you know, are things that we talked about with Aina Aloha Economic Futures. And one thing that we did do was we built values. We said, hey, you know, can we work on this together? We want to be inclusive. People signed on. My colleagues that are much smarter than me developed sort of a matrix for decision making, saying, hey, if you want to embed and move towards these values so it doesn't just sit on paper, here's a way you can measure your decisions, whether you're an organization a business leader, a funder, to try to make better decisions and implement them. And yet, here we are continuing to work on it, to push the envelope. The change that we need, Matt, it can't come quick enough, but damn, it's slow.
Kamana, I'm really glad that you brought up Aina Aloha Economic Futures, and I posted a link in the chat there for folks. It's some of the most exciting work I've seen for all the global attention that the Aloha Plus Challenge work gets and all of that. That we one of the life's principles that we articulated earlier, right, was attuned, locally attuned. And what could be more locally attuned than drawing on ancestral knowledge from peoples who not only survived here, but thrived and flourished in these islands for generations, and in fact, took care of these islands in ways that are so far beyond quote unquote sustainable, right? That Kirsten, Sumner, myself, everybody on this call, can enjoy these gifts and live here today. And one thing that gives me really so much hope is our youth. And so you brought up the decision-making framework and the rubric that was developed. And that was developed by a robust community process. There were multiple conversations, and those conversations continue in different formats and forums and iterations to this day. One of the projects I'm most excited about working on right now is helping a 20-year-old Native Hawaiian woman build a company that is based on those Aina Aloha Economic Futures rubric. And we helped her to take that rubric and think about all of her incredible friends that were building and creating their own artisanal products with this radically ethical set of values, right? That is never going to show up on an organic certification or anything like that. And she actually created her own certification to help tell these stories. This generation gets it. I don't have to sit there and explain, they're just off to the races. And now the 3 other co-founders who are closer to my age are trying to keep up with her and just doing the best we can. And of course, it's a social media play too, right? I'll drop a link there. It's a shameless plug for the Malka Market. But I do that because the seeds of that beautiful new future are here, and they're in Malka Market, and they're in so many other of these small, tiny, emergent responses to the conditions of our times. As is nature's way, it happens from the bottom up. So we have to train ourselves to have the eyes to see and value those tiny things so that we can begin to nourish them and connect them and cultivate them, so that those individuals that are telling individual versions of that compelling story can now start to describe that collective, right, which draws us forth. That's how change happens in nature. It's emergent, it's constant, it's never ending. And humans are, the great innovation of Homo sapiens is our ability to invent fictions, like the fiction of money, like the fiction of commerce. And imagine if we remembered the story of love of place, of love of land, of caring for, of land as brother, land as mother, what might be possible then. Sumner and Kirsten, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this.
I think there is a yearning by people to move to a different state of the economy. I mean, I don't think people are happy. Polls show this. Conversations I have with other people I know in the community just show this all the time, that people are not happy with the state with where we are. There's times that there's a little bit of a utopian feeling sometimes what the alternatives might be. I have lots of friends tell me, "Oh, I'm worried my children might have to go overseas, might have to go abroad meaning the U.S. or foreign country, to essentially use their talents that they're picking up here." And of course, the answer is, in a small place like Hawaii, we're always going to offer a limited market for talent. Good talent is always going to find that it will want to go to a bigger market. There'll be more returns there. But we do need to we do need to look at what we're able to offer children in local families and see if we can do better. And I just think there's lots of areas where we can do a lot better. I look at the area of agriculture, which has received so much attention. And I don't necessarily agree with all of the approaches that are being put forth on how to revitalize agriculture. But one thing I'm confident about is that we can do a better job than what we're doing today. I look at the government programs that are there to support agriculture, and I've been very critical of them. My writings on the Hawaii Agribusiness Corporation, I have been somewhat scathing, basically saying that the corporation has done a dismal job and has basically wasted the resources given to it. We have the potential to have a larger farming community here, not as large, I think, as some people think it would be, but we have a potential to revive farming here. And yet what that's going to require is more of a reform of government. It isn't just giving the same people more money. We really need some governmental reform. Why don't we get as much governmental reform as perhaps we want? And I think a lot of it goes back to the lack of political competition in the state. We have a dominant Democratic Party, and we have a bankrupt opposition party, the Republicans. Sorry about that. Yeah, there's a few reasonable people in there, but not many. And I think that's a serious problem in this state and in many other states in the United States. You really need to have two political parties that are coming forth with reasonable ideas. They're coming forth with ideas that if the other person's elected, you say, I'm not sure I want to go that direction, but that's not a terrible direction. It's something I could live with. We don't have that today. And the conversations inside the Democratic Party aren't enough, I think, to really develop that level of final electoral competition. We need more of that. And I think that's one of the problems that Hawaii faces is how do we create a politically more vibrant atmosphere? And we find it difficult. I think like a lot of the country, we find that we're trapped a bit in a box. We need to get out of that box and to find ways to do some political reform too. Otherwise, voices won't be heard. I just want to conclude this whole thing by saying, of course, change doesn't just come via government. Change comes via private initiative, and change comes via nonprofits forming and influencing government. And on that front, Hawaii's not in such bad shape. I see lots of vigor in that area, and I expect to see more in coming years.
Yeah, Matt, I think you phrased it so eloquently. I'm kind of a brass tacks sort of person. I want to see that vision, right? But it's going to take very meticulous disassembling of a system, right? Piece by piece, from all the way from kind of macroeconomic policy down to how our governance institutions are framed, right? I don't think they fit the system that we want, and that we are compelled to have because we have exceeded all of our natural limits and our societal goals. We're not attaining those, right? But I mean, I see a role for direct action, right? I mean, in the streets, rebellion. I don't know if you all saw Chip Fletcher's talk, but he's like, I'm vegan, and I think all of you should be on the street voting out these hoodlums in office. They're killing you off, right? And I think there's a role for that. But there's also a role for folks to really think about how do we think our policies, everything from energy policy to my favorite, sanitation, right? We need to rework every municipal service, like everything has to really be looked at critically in order to rethink or how we're doing things, right? And so, I think we focus a lot on science and technology education, but we also need the environmental psychologists, and we need these other skills to think about how do we incentivize people to behave differently. Then it's not just about economics, right? Like the economists think they have dominion over behavior change through market-based incentives, right? But I think what we've learned over the past couple of decades of social science research is that social norms play an incredibly big role, right? And if we really want to shift this mindset, we shouldn't only think about the quantitative, but we need to really dig into the qualitative and understand what motivates people. What are the theories of behavior change? It's my plug for the social sciences beyond economics, right there.
I just want to note there too, though, that the session is the session's title was a circular economy. And I do want to note that many years ago, Ken Boulding came to visit, who's really the founder of the circular economy concept. He came to visit the University of Hawaii. And he gave several talks that were pretty well attended. He was emphasizing then spaceship Earth, that we're a spaceship. We're not an open frontier. It's a spaceship. And then students were asking him, is Hawaii a spaceship? Then he wasn't quite sure. Well, in some ways it's a spaceship, and in some ways there's lots of other spaceships circulating, and there's exchange between the spaceships. But what struck me was not so much his he was a lovely man and somewhat eccentric, but when he came to my class, he picked up the trash bin in the class, stuck it up by the speaker podium, and said, "Why is it free to dispose of what you're drinking there, class? Why should you be able to put your garbage in here for free? If it was charged, you would think twice about the container that your drink was in, et cetera, et cetera." So he was really big on that. It was a very effective thing. I still have students who come up to me on the street and say, "I remember that garbage can being placed up at the podium." So he made an impact. And I think that is the type of thing we need to be thinking more about today. Just, I think on the small islands, to me, I'm just picking up on Kirsten's note about the disposal things. That's a huge item here. We don't like to talk about it. We don't like to talk about it. It all comes down to, we're going to keep the landfill in West Oahu open, and lots of Sturm and Drang, and finally we extend it. We don't talk about fundamental issues with that. And I think that's one of the serious problems with local politics. It's a bit of a third rail of local politics because NIMBYism is so big there. Nobody wants to find there's a disposal place in their neighborhood, or people don't want to deal with the issue. But it's one that we absolutely have to deal with as an island economy. That conversation needs to be had, and it's starting to be had with stuff like the disposable utensils.
Really good points. Kamana, you've done some really cutting edge work with some international partners, exploring the meeting of wisdoms between, Western empirical science and indigenous knowledge and Ike Hawaii, specifically around circular economy and Aloha Aina. And I'm wondering, would you be willing to share some of the key insights or perhaps wonderings from that work?
Yeah, no, thank you, Matt. And mahalo, Sumner. I think circular economies has been a developing concept, and it does bridge social science and natural sciences and economics and biomimicry. And so it's been a fairly interesting space to consider. The way I was introduced to circular economies is really like this attempt to mimic the living systems of our world, of our planet, the ones that have existed for millennia, because nothing is wasted, because waste in those systems becomes a resource, right? And we can think about it in somewhat morbid terms. I'm here speaking today, but 200 years from now, I'm feeding a tree. I become soil, and what I leave behind, hopefully, are some good things and some good ideas. But that's really what the circular economy is about: is being regenerative, is designing out waste. And there's a blue loop and there's a green loop. And the green loop really looks at renewable energy and ways that we can try to mimic the natural systems, and the blue loop is really looking at refurbishing, recycling materials, keeping them in process, in use for as long as possible. And essentially, the insight that I love is that it's really a design problem. We've designed this linear economy to profit on making waste. We allow that to happen. We've designed a linear economy that, allows profit to be shared by the 1% mostly, and very minimal inputs into working class people and lifestyles and their quality of life and well-being. So we can design better systems. And I think that's really the insight. My colleagues at the University of Augsburg, we have an MOU, we've published papers. If you look up Aloha Aina and the circular economy, you'll see some of our work. Really, this bridging of, they're incredible economists, they're numbers people, they're engineers. And so they see these problems in different facets than I might. But when they come here to Hawaii, I think they see the origin of the earlier circular economy, which is Aloha Aina, which is indigenous knowledge. And here in Hawaii, it's so vibrant, and we can go and visit communities, whether it's Paipai'oheia, Paipai'oheia, we can go to Waipa Foundation, Kako'iwi, I mean, all across our islands. Go to Molokai, spend some time with people restoring fish ponds, and you'll see, you know, the principles of malama, of circularity that are involved. And so Hawaii is innovative. I think people that tell you that we're not just aren't looking in the right places. Let me be frank. If you have an old paradigm and worldview, and you think that that's what leadership is like, then you might not see the innovation that's happening across our communities. But if you look at Aina Aloha Economic Futures, and you look at the engagement and the resilience of our communities, we have a lot going on here. So mahalo for that, you know, that Matt sharing and that insight. And I think it's a continued conversation. That's why Kate, you know, I think was interested in learning more about Hawaii and bridging Doughnut Economics and what's happening in Hawaii, is because we are innovating. Unfortunately, we're up against a monolith in many ways when we talk about changing our economic system here in Hawaii. But that doesn't mean there's not a whole bunch of resilience and innovation happening on the ground. So I'm incredibly inspired by that. And, you know, there's these issues all across the world, land back, you know, recognizing social justice issues that, yeah, we need to think about the way that we tell these narratives and then who benefits from these economic systems. So I feel like this is an incredible time where these things are bubbling up. Others want to share, I mean, some of the pockets I see of innovation around circular economies, or Matt said regenerative economies, Aloha Aina. Can we think of, we visited this village, it's called Wildspodried in Bavaria, Germany. And it really blew me away. And I'll share, you know, went there, and they're a small town, about 2,500 people, and they got early on, you know, interested in investing in their own energy. They're a farming community, and so they wanted to sort of find new sources of income, you know. And you go there now, and there's PV panels, you know, all across every barn. They're utilizing the methane from the cattle and putting it into biodigesters. They particularly are okay with wind farms. So they have, you know, these giant wind farms. And today they're producing 500% more power than they consume. Germany passed the law, said, hey, anyone produces power companies got to buy it. And now you have this really resilient community that's, you know, making substantial amounts of returns on their initial investment because of these policy changes, right? And coming from Hawaii, at first I was like, wait, is this for real? I think I asked about 3 versions of the same question. And in fact, when my colleagues from Germany came here to Hawaii and presented this, there was about 8 questions in a row, almost the same question, saying, how is this possible? How did they do this? How did the power companies allow it? And so, you know, are there other stories or places of innovation maybe that we can build off of or learn from that we've seen, whether here locally or in other places in the world? Maybe we could take a stab at that.
Who would like to go first? Go ahead, Kirsten, please.
Well, no, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously there are examples at all sorts of different scales, right? So, you know, we have cities that are taking on the challenge of I think Bill posted Stockholm, right, of recycling water and zero trash, and we've got you know, everything down to you know, like villages, like, you know, you're talking about, to households, to individuals who have made decisions to live a life that, you know, zero waste life. We had a friend here in Hawaii who tried to, you know, live her life with zero waste. And I mean, there are loads of examples from the Netherlands, of different provinces. The entire country of the Netherlands has a water board that governs water throughout the country, and it tries to ensure, a zero waste water systems. And, the idea is that the raw material flows are understood and captured and reused in productive ways and not turned into green sludge or heavy metal depositions, et cetera. I mean, all of that has value somewhere to someone. It's a matter of figuring out where those loops are and how you can get them back into the system. And instead of letting it just be the linear economy where you extract it, you use it, you dispose of it, and it becomes a problem, right? So I'm part of this great new group called the Ocean Sewage Alliance. And I am obsessed with poo, it's true. But there's a real issue. There are many places that have embraced the fact that waste systems, for getting household waste systems, we can recover energy, we can recover nutrients, we can recover water from it, right? And there's absolutely no reason in Hawaii that we should be disposing of highly treated wastewater into our ocean, right? But the problem is we are in a bit of a trap because of EPA regulations, right? So it's not as if we've decided, oh, we're disgusted by this, we don't want it. That's part of it, but it's because we've got these structures that have locked us into a certain path. And so we need to start thinking more creatively, and instead of thinking large scale, bringing it down household scale, community scale, et cetera. So there are lots of communities who've decided, disconnect from the municipal system and think about the waste system and reuse it all on site. So I'll start with that and then let others give some examples.
Mahalo, Kirsten. Sumner, were you gonna jump in? Yep.
I'm also, I do look at, I think water issues are large here. And some of those don't necessarily go back to traditional values. I mean, we get most of our water off of the aquifer, where in the old days, the aquifer really wasn't tapped. There wasn't much of a realization it was there. And yet I look at some of the things that threaten the aquifer, and they seem really extreme. Seeing these fuel tanks at Red Hill, this is not a new problem. This has been going on for a long time. I think this is the type of thing where a better political leadership in the state would bring some of these things to fruition. The problems of septic tanks hooking people up to sewers, having better ways of disposing of sewage in rural areas. It's something that we have to address more frontally. It's just not a problem that should go on for very long. And yet it impacts an awful lot of people who are not necessarily very rich. It impacts a lot of property owners in rural areas who don't necessarily make high incomes, but have the property. They don't really quite know how they're going to get from A to B. It's really important that we figure out ways to get people from A to B. And I think that these are the types of problems that we look at and we say, it's going to take just tons of money. Let's just kind of kick that can down the road. Hawaii has been known for spending too little on infrastructure since the 1980s. It's one of those areas that we've economized on. There's a consensus among most economists in the state that we just haven't spent what it takes to keep up infrastructure that keeps us healthy, that keeps the environment in better shape, and we need to do more of that. That's a fundamental note. It might require higher taxes. It might require a trade-off somewhere, but we've got to do better in dealing with some of the nuts and bolts. There's been whole political campaigns at the county level that have been run on, we're gonna take care of the roads, the sewers, and whatever. And yet, when you actually look at the spending that occur across administrations, it's not that different. It doesn't matter if it's Republican, Democrat, or whether it's a more union-based person who's often in favor of infrastructure spending, or someone who's more budget-minded. We just don't get a lot more spending. We absolutely need to have more infrastructure spending in some of these areas, or else we're going to find that some of these problems really come back and bite us.
Yeah, mahalo for that, Sumner. Certainly agree. More development on infrastructure, more investment in the staffing for our departments that manage water and resources, that check for invasive species. I mean, I think those are all areas that we could improve on. I do want to just one sort of point of clarification. We certainly understood, if we say kapokane, here in Hawaii, we certainly understood the aquifers. And in fact, there's an entire ancestral chant called Mele no Kane that talks about the entire water cycle and system. And, getting back to, again, living on islands and thinking about the intimacy and knowledge of place, we lived in a society where there were experts who understood groundwater leaking, in ponds off of Kohala, diving off cliffs to gather groundwater. So incredibly ancestral values tied to water and its management. Having been on State Water Resource Management Commission for the last 8 years and worked intimately on these issues, I can assure everyone that our knowledge systems were incredibly helpful, and in fact, cutting edge in many ways in solving water issues here in Hawaii. But thank you for that. Matt, do you want to add to this?
Oh, what to say? There's so many compelling examples that we can draw from, our global family. And kind of your point, Kamana, is there's many very compelling examples here, right under our noses. And so often the value, simple, I think Einstein said things should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And so the ingenuity and the genius in some of these, quote unquote, simple systems are actually quite deep. And so one example, I think that a common theme I've been picking up from your comments is that political change is necessary. This is clear. And I think that the amount of complexity that we all have to navigate in today's world demands new models of leadership, governance, and decision-making. And when I say new, I mean KNEW, as in remembered ways. And one of the key lessons for me, one of the most profound lessons for me from not just Native Hawaiian culture, but from other indigenous cultures that I've been fortunate to study and learn from, is this decentering of self and of title and of position. And it's a deferment to who has the most embodied knowledge. There's a scholar, Tyson Yunkaporta, he's an Aboriginal scholar. My other half of my family's from Australia, so it's near and dear place to me. And he describes as they're moving through the landscape, if they're coming up to a river and the youngest person in the party is the person that's closest to that knowledge, the party will defer to the child because he's closest to the experienced embodied knowledge of that place. And so this requires a radical reimagination of our roles and our responsibilities to ourselves, to each other, and to our places. And I think that it calls for all of us to live into the fullest expressions of ourselves, whatever that might be. If that's running for office, then great, do it. If it's about policy, then great, we need you there. If it's about starting a regenerative enterprise, even in your backyard, then great, we need that too. We need all experiments are vitally important in this time. All of the mutations that we can throw out in response to our changing condition. I'll close with the vision that's put forth by Uncle Bruce Keolani and Auntie Kehaula at Manoa Valley to restore a healthy, thriving koa and ohia forest in Manoa Valley. It's a very small and simple idea, but imagine what, just from straight economic terms, if we were to replace the many thousands of acres that we don't have sufficient funding to manage with albizia and replant that with high value native hardwood species like koa, economically speaking, that's a no-brainer, but think about all the other actually primary benefits, the ecological benefits, the cultural benefits, the socio-emotional benefits, the healing that takes place with that. So I'll drop that link, and looks like Kamana Rogers signaling we're close to the end, so I'll turn it back to you to wrap us up.
And, thank you, Sumner, Kirsten, Matt, everyone in the chat. It's been a robust, really fruitful conversation, diverse points of view. But, I think we're all on point here, knowing that Hawaii can adapt, Hawaii must adapt. And we've done it historically, through different periods of leadership. And here we are today with our time at the helm. And so I just want to thank everyone here. There's so many things that we can do for circular economies. I just think of the waste that comes through the tourism sector, just in food, in wasted food. Now, if we captured even a portion of that and turned it into organic mulch, that can take away some of the imports that we have for chemical fertilizers, or like Kirsten said, if we better manage our wastewater, that you can get nutrients out of our kukai for growing plants and anthuriums and other things, right? I mean, there's so many things that we could do. Pump storage for energy that deals with, saves water and also is a renewable way of generating energy. But I think the key is, though, if we don't solve for the social economic inequality, right? If we simply replace the old structures with new ones that continue to oppress people and don't care for our Aina and our communities, our time at the helm will not be successful. And so I want to ask everyone out there, keep on keeping on, dig deep, imua me ke aloha Aina. But this is going to continue. This conversation will continue. And thank you for your leadership, everyone here on the panel today. Mahalo.
Aloha. Thank you, panel. That was a really wonderful discussion, and one to be continued, and one to which the festival is committed to continuing. And attendees, just to remind you, you and your ohana and your networks who missed this can find it again on the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series YouTube, on Facebook, and we will have an edited version for highlights, so I can't imagine they're going to edit very much. And that will be on our website for at least a year. So again, thank you very much, panelists, and thank you, attendees. Aloha.